Well, my screen and computer is telling me that it's show time. And this is, of course, Journey of an Aesthete podcast. I'm your host, Mitch Hampton. First, I'd like to ask our producer, Laurie Strickland, about the sound quality, how it is. It's important that things can be heard and seen. That's excellent. So this is, we're in January, New Year. This is sort of a New Year's show. A little bit of a New Year's show, a little bit of a wrap up, but it's also our major episode for January, season 7. We're going to talk for the very first time inside this episode about how I personally create this podcast, or rather how I prepare for episodes, how this podcast itself came into being. And this is going to be part 1. We're going to, I think, have 2 parts on this very topic. So this isn't only going to be art and the podcast, as I put it, or art and podcast. But it's going to be part 1, and there's going to be a part 2, maybe a part 3. I don't know yet if it's going to be a trilogy or 2, but I think 1 is not enough. So we're going to talk a little bit about my early life, talk about the podcast. This is something I haven't done in a long time. What I'm going to say now, when I used to do these aesthetic streams, I used to always start with what I'm wearing. Haven't done that in a year or so. I'm going to do it now. So this coat, they would call it a coat in the UK, here a jacket, is a little bit dressy. It's an odd jacket. That is odd, meaning odd matched. It's not as part of a suit. It's meant to be worn separately. It's a little on the dressy side. It's meant to be worn in the winter, as you can see, but it has a softness to it. Look at these buttons. This is handmade, bespoke garments. A little on the soft side because it has a little bit of tweedy quality in the cloth. Even though it is dark, it's sort of a mixture of black with little blue flecks in it, which you can't see. Maybe if I put it up there, you can see those little blue flecks. It's related to Donegal, Irish wool, and it is a woolen garment. I'm wearing kind of rather formal tie from Britain. I'm wearing my girlfriend's jewelry, believe it or not. This collar bar that I have on now was made by Joanne Marilyn Davis Woods. Call her Joe. She made this beautiful in silver. And this is a new for Christmas. I got this wonderful, we call it a tie bar, I guess. So a collar bar, tie bar, artificial boutonniere, handkerchief, a kind of a formal vest, and similar to felt, what you would see at a billiard pool table. It's rather heavy fabric. Why am I wearing this kind of clothing? Not so much the style, which is formal because it's sort of a special show. So I dress a little more formally than I normally would, but what we would call the weights. Well, it's 15 degrees. The last time I checked, and maybe it went up to 20, but starting this morning it was like 15. Unusually cold, the kind of bitter, bone-chilling cold, which is something to consider when probably 48 hours ago it was 70 degrees. So this is a very strange time in my life with climate, and we're doing the show, thankfully, under heated circumstances here. So this is the book that I got, also from Laurie, our producer, to help out with organization. I'm always trying to get better organized. She's a producer, so she knows about organization. But these are my notes for today's show. See? January 2026, new year. Look at all those notes. Look, all for today's show. So as you can see, my show is not totally improvised. There's a bit of planning that goes into it. Depending upon the episode or the style or the subject, more or less planning. Today's a bit more. So I'm going to actually refer to this as if it's like a script, as if we're doing a table read. Is that what they call it? You folks do table reads, right? And your profession. and you sit at a table like this. Well, I'm going to get out my glasses. I'm going to see what I plan for today. Let's see here. January 15th show. I have at the very top cultural education. Now, what do I mean by that? So, to really talk about our show, we kind of have to go back to 1967, 1970, 71, 72, 73, 74, those years, for age 5, 6, and then later on, late 70s. Why? Well, I've often talked about, the experience of not having access to any musical instruments, having no neighbors who played an instrument or who were in a band, at least neighbors I knew personally, not being fortunate to have integrated into a school structure where there was band and there was wind ensemble and all this stuff. I just, for whatever reason in those years, my love for music, my learning about music happened through records. And I talk about the same records a lot because, well, they seem important to me. The little Miles Davis French film soundtrack for Louis Malle, the Elevator to the Gallows, with Jean Moreau, Walking Through the Streets of Paris, and from the 50s, 57. That being the first Miles Davis I heard, not Kind of Blue, not the more famous Birth of the Cool, but that. L'Ascension pour les Chevaux, I think is the French. So that was a little record on Fontana Records, a French record company that... and I talked about the Beatles' Sgt. Pepper, which came out the year of my birth, and I did listen to Sgt. Pepper, and my parents would put on, I'd play over and over again. I would have to ask them to play because I'm fascinated with A Day in the Life. The whole album, Sgt. Pepper, Mr. Kite, and all those odd songs and that sort of English music hall influenced Beatles. So I'm a creature of Sgt. Pepper in that sense, and Miles Davis. But I especially loved A Day in the Life. And it was kind of an orchestral song, as you know, and it has a sweeping strains and George Martin and orchestration. And I think, I guess that the important thing about all these records, and this is the real kind of the supreme theme or idea, is that like all of us, we aren't really choosing any of this stuff, like the stuff I'm describing. We're selecting from what's available, of course, and we're exercising a certain amount of agency, but we're essentially I use the phrase, we're at the mercy of what's around us. So if I were in a household that had no record player, that had no records to speak of, I would not have that to gravitate to, right? So I was fortunate that I had Miles Davis and the Beatles around, right? If you think that's a good thing to be exposed to in music. And Bach's Brandenburg Concerto. But I forgot something really important when I talk about, these kind of early records. And, no musical instrument, just only listening, laying on the floor. I'd be like this. I'd put on the music and I'd sit there and I'd rock back and forth and listen to this music. But because of the sort of the splash of this movie, Sanson Blue, which is about Neil Diamond fans, a little bit, in Milwaukee, I found this. This is one of the very first records that I had, same time period. And it's this. Jonathan Livingston Seagull, Neil Diamond. This is the very original motion picture soundtrack. There's Neil Diamond in the 70s. This is, yeah. Look at that. So back when we had records, also the subject of a recent Morgan's episode, the record store, talking about records. I don't know how I forgot this. Probably because Neil Diamond is not among my favorites. I like him, but I'm not a super fan. It's not my favorite kind of music, as we know. It's more the stuff I mentioned earlier. But just to think about the packaging. Look at the design of this thing. Look at that. Look at that. Look at someone actually designed this. So what, and look, he even painted they painted they put a photo on Look at this. If that weren't enough, of course, remember the little booklets. Now, this kind of stuff with the you can see here. Can you see that embossed? Yeah. So they really wanted to give you a lot for your money in the 70s. If you bought a record, they'd give you pictures and tickets and, you know, kind of photographs and poetry like Rod McEwen's poetry, right? Or, and, you know, lyrics, Dear Father, and this. And of course, this is a very, if you know the movie The Ice Storm, the An Lee film based on the, I think, really good Rick Moody novel. All the characters are reading Jonathan Livingston Seagull in that novel because of the time period, the sort of the self-realization. Esalen, of course, Werner Erhard and S. That's all kind of the ethic of this film about seagulls and this music. But I thought it was great to discover one of the very first records I held in my hand and I listened to. I think because my dad was a Neil Diamond fan. I think at that time he was. So I think of all this as sort of cultural education, almost cultural literacy in a sense. So for example, if I were... So I was born in 67, as I said. If I were born in 1992, like so many people are, there's such a huge swollen generation, there's so many of them, millennials and Zoomers and the folks born in the early 2000s, 90s, I may have been stuck with growing up in a household where, I don't know, maybe the music was very different. Maybe Garth Brooks is what everybody listened to and not Miles Davis and the Beatles, or maybe the parents, or maybe they didn't listen to music at all, or maybe, you know, I'm getting ready for this true crime episode with Deb about serial killers, and Richard Ramirez loved to crank up AC/DC while he raped and murdered women, and he did do that and wore the AC/DC. So maybe, who knows, maybe Back in Black was what let's say I had parents that were deadbeat parents or drug addict parents or rock and roll parents or whatever you want to call it. I don't want to cast any aspersions on AC/DC fans, but, or saying AC/DC fans were all serial killers like Richard Ramirez was in the 80s, but that could have been my environment. So it's all environment. And so that's why I think environment's important. Environment, literacy, exposure to things. One of my earliest concerts, of course, was the Jackson 5 in Madison Square Garden. And I love the sound of that music. And Michael Jackson and family and company in those years as children, they literally did covers of Sly and the Family Stone. They didn't just do ABC. And so I was exposed to a cover, their version of Stand and Everyday People, you know, Sly Stone. And it's kind of a mystery, you know, why is it that I really resonated with the Jackson 5 concert? Maybe it was Madison Square Garden in New York in 1970. I don't know. I think I just loved and preferred, you know, what we would call African American or rhythm and blues music more than I did the more pop kind of Neil Diamond music. Although I did like the orchestration of Neil Diamond, which just fascinated me. I also listened to Jesus Christ Superstar. We called it the Brown Album. And I went to see the original show of Ted Neely. Again, as a 2 or 3 year old, I went to the original production of Hair. Diane Keaton was in that cast, I think. I mean, they had some notable people in the cast. And, you know, as you know, in the original Hair, everybody gets neck edge streaks, takes off their clothes. And as a baby, I got up on stage and the cast welcomed me up on stage. So imagine me, Mitch, in diapers on the stage of Hair, the show Hair. I think there's something to that. If you talk about influence and environment, I may be wearing a coat and tie today, but, you know, I'm always have a direct connection, quite literally a direct connection with McDermott, Galt McDermott, Hair, Ragney, Jerome Ragney, that you know, 60s, 70s. Yeah, it's amazing. And I remember being on stage with these people, just let the sunshine in, you know? So I was seeing these musicals in the 70s. I was seeing Jackson 5, and some classical concerts. Also New York City Ballet, the great duo of Peter Martin and Suzanne Farrow. Oh, parents listening to music on earbuds. Well, yeah, everybody's so isolated they don't share the music. That's true. So this music was very much shared. And I discovered a novel, a paperback, not only V, which I talked about in our last episode with Joe, the pension episode. That's the same paperback, V. But I also discovered a little book called 1984 by George Orwell. And I read, one of the first books I read was that. Interesting choice. And then later on I had to read Animal Farm for outdoors. And then the other big influence, and we're getting into literature and words and prose, it was the play Hamlet. My dad kind of felt strongly that we had to know about one play, and he chose Hamlet. And for an entire summer, me and my friend Greg would literally be homeschooled by my dad on that one play. We'd go by scene, and we would have been 10 years old. It was 77, 78. It was actually roughly, let me show you this. This is me at the age of 10 in 1977. Look at my haircut, my bowl haircut. Copying The Character on 8 is Enough. Nicholas Bradford, if you know that show. Yeah. There I am in my I'd only been playing piano for a year. And I was really nervous because I think I had to go play piano for somebody. Some teacher in New York. I really don't remember the date, but you could see the New York City skyline. It's not great, but you could sort of look at that in the 70s. So that's me at age 10, around the year that I had to study Hamlet. You might call it an early version of homeschooling with my dad. And that's something to read Hamlet. There were no VHS. Think about this. No CDs, no VHS. We had 8 tracks and records. Yeah, interesting. Well, I think it makes a big difference to read Hamlet as a child or as a teenager. I think if you're 10 years old and you're looking at Hamlet, or maybe 11 and 12, it's a little different than reading it as a 20-year-old, or it's probably, you're missing something. You're gonna miss, so you were lucky that you, I guess, got to do it properly. Maybe if you want to look at it that way. Although, actually, Mark Edmondson, who I hung out with some, wrote a book called Why Read. He also wrote a book called Teacher. He's on the dream list of guests. I haven't written the letter to Mark Edmondson. Mark Edmondson was a student of Harold Bloom back in the 80s, 70s, 80s. He said that Shakespeare's for everybody. He says that he always took his kids to see As You Like It and Midsummer, and he says his children enjoyed it. And so he said that there was, I don't know, he talked a little bit about that. But anyhow, Hamlet. So I'm going to refer to my notes because this is such a big topic, this podcast in general. So there's all these records, there's all this music. But, it wasn't until 2017, 2018, 2019, now, sort of close to now, that I even thought about doing any show like this. It would not have been an idea in my mind 10 years ago, 12 years ago. I wouldn't have even thought of it. I wouldn't have cared to think of it. I didn't, it was not on my radar. I was dealing with many things. So one of the really notable things, if you want to call it that, about starting this podcast in 2019 and those years, 2018, we're going to go back and I'm going to show you my very first notes in this book in a second here, is that my life was in one of the worst places then. It was just very, very, very unfortunate. I was fired from my own business. That means my salary ended. I had to leave my home of Boston of 35 some years. And I didn't know where I was going to be living. And I couldn't find a place to rent for a whole year. I looked and looked and looked. It was a nightmare. I didn't know where I was going to live. My life was in upheaval. So I actually started this podcast at my lowest point in my life. Then it would have been, let's see, I'm 58 now. I guess 52, 53 years old. Lowest, just awful. I was uprooted and had to come down here to Weaverville, North Carolina. I was very, I didn't know, this is a new culture. I didn't know what I was doing. I knew I had to live here because I found a place to live, thankfully, and I'm here, and I have reunited with my piano. But what was really on my mind when I started this podcast was not podcasts at all. It was sort of, you might say, survival and where am I going to live, and probably the greatest change in economic fortune that can befall a person, relatively speaking. And the other thing is I was focused on solo piano. I would say almost exclusively. And my hard listening project, which continues. And I was really trying at that time to make a go of that becoming some kind of I guess you might say a big thing or bigger thing than it ever turned out. And so I didn't know what was going to happen with that, but a lot of energy went into that, composing and practicing piano. So it's interesting that I came down here as reunited with this piano. So to get in the spirit of that, I'm going to improvise now some things in that just to do it. Kind of what I was thinking of. A little bit. Get a drink of coffee here and just see. How does that sound? So what I'm going to do now is spontaneously improvise in the hard listening style that I developed. So it's not going to be pre-planned or pre-written. Close to total spontaneity. See what happens. It won't be long. So don't be. Something like that. That's totally made up on the fly. I hope that wasn't too long, but that's kind of what I was, that's kind of what I was focused on in 2018. So I had to, in a way, put that aside, a little bit. I mean, not totally, but you can only do so much in a day. And so when Lori suggested I do an episode on making our show, at first I wasn't against the idea, but I was unsure about it. I was a little bit resistant only because I maybe had other ideas, or I never thought, it's tricky to talk about what we do. It's easier, as I just did there, to just play some damn music, sit down and play it, than to maybe analyze it or talk about it or show how it's made. But I in those days, I guess in New York, I was still up there more than I am now. Thinking about the piano, I thought, well, what do we do? What is a podcast? So I did have an opportunity over the, both right before the pandemic, COVID times, and during, to, watch a few podcasts. Now, I haven't seen that many, and some of them I had on my show. So at that time, I had Projection Booth on my show, and, some folks that were doing things, and I thought that's interesting. And I have to say, of all the shows I watched or listened to, I wasn't, I didn't love a lot of what I heard. So even the ones that were good, I wasn't crazy about. Maybe because it wasn't my jam. One of the things about our show is that it's an aesthetics show, which is important. It's not a show, it's only natural, if you're going to have a thing like a podcast where people talk like I am now. It's only natural. Then the great bulk of it might be news, advice, psychology, religion, very, I would say kind of, podcast that I've heard, I would use the word tendentious to describe them. Now that's a descriptive term, the way I'm using it. They were shows of advocacy. They were sometimes shows about good versus evil. They were shows of news and politics. They were partisan. They were, and they are. And they were rather topical, and they were filled with advice, and some of them were telling you how to live. There's in terms like new words like influencers, which didn't exist 15 years ago. And I was thinking, well, where do I fit into this? I wanted to be a kind of an antidote to all that. I wanted to have a show. Two things I wanted to show. I wanted the show to have a maximum of diversity of artistic style. So I would have commercial and uncommercial people on the same show, ideally at the same table. So these would be people that don't really like what each other do, actually. Not always dislike, but there was a higher risk that they weren't each other's jam. Like say a TV producer and alongside somebody who lives off the grid and makes shows on a camcorder or something, or make shows on their phone. They would have very little in common. They might stylistically be at odds, not only in terms of budget, but also they might be at odds in terms of quality. One might be better than the other. So I was kind of confused. So I know I wanted the show to have this kind of diversity, to have different styles. And that was important to me. And that was my way of being I guess at the time, kind of multicultural, not in an ethnicity sense, and not even in an identity sense, but in terms of different cultures, avant-garde and non-avant-garde. So the very first show we had of all things was John Jost. And I have here my first notebook of the first show. And I'm going to, since we're talking about how the show came together, I'm glad I saved all this stuff. So I did this trumpet player on the bed of lips here. And I dug out some examples. Of the notes I took. This is interesting. And I thought, why John Jost? Well, I kind of knew John Jost. I had appreciated the fact that when he came to Boston, not only did I hang out with him twice, he filmed me playing piano for a Vimeo video. In sitting at the piano like I was just doing now. And I thought his films were interesting, but he's I think he was our first show. He's thoroughly, I'm going to say some adjectives, thoroughly, is he intransigent, independent, uncompromising, iconoclastic, steadfast, stubborn, making his own kinds of things, his own kinds of movies. And that's an interesting way to start with a person who makes films totally from scratch, not for a studio. So when I plan an episode with a guest, so I want to talk a little bit about the ethics of having a guest. So that was really important, and is really important to me. So when I have a guest on the show, I think about that guest as a person before the show to the degree to which I can. If it's an author I really, really like, I might know a lot about them. I try to know a little bit more about them. I try to read a lot of what they've done. That's not always possible. If it's an author that I'm fortunate to have on the show about whom I am not an expert, I try to familiarize myself a little bit with them. I try to at least read one work by them. So James Sturz, I read his underwater book about sea life and his magical, I read that novel for his show. And I read it, I wanted to be prepared for him to discuss that and other things and familiarize. Jamie Kober-Riston, she's a writer. I read a lot of her work, The God Tree, Shark Girls. I knew her daughter, I knew her. I was friendly with both mother and daughter, and I did shows on both those individuals. And so for Jamie Kober's show, I tried to read as much as I could of her. Short stories, Stalking the God Tree, and some of the earlier. You have to dig up some of these things. They're not always easy to find. In the case of John Jost, I had seen in 1987, 88, on television at 3 a.m, Rembrandt Laughing. I guess PBS screened it, and then of course, around the same time I saw also, because it was on PBS, all the Vermeers in New York, 2 big hits of his that were successful. So this is what it looks like when I have a show. Very first, let's look and see what it looks like here. Here we go. July. It was in July where we started. And here you go. John Jost. There it is. There it is. Jon, John Jost. I'm going to get out my glasses. I'm going to look and see how much I plan. How much do I plan? What do I not plan? What do I leave to chance or fate or God or contingency, circumstance? Well, a little bit of both, right? So I said John Jost has made completely handcrafted and truly independent films. He's sui generis. These are my notes. Let's see here. This is interesting to look at my writing, which has deteriorated even since 2018. I had Daniel Kramer on the show. There were a lot of film people in the beginning. See, I love film. And so I had even Mel Mayron, Film Associated, Andrew Bajowski. You know, these are all in this book. And so what I will do is I'll write the person. I'll say guest notes. Now, this is for Daniel Kramer. And I have on here Overwhelm the Sky at the top. And I have under here, he has seen everything. So that means that he's seen every movie. I have his book back there. Adventures in Auteurism. Do you see the sprockets of the film? Right in the multicolored film projection. Well, that's his newest book. So I have on here, he's seen everything. And that's a note to myself to remind myself that he may have seen more movies than I have. Me and QT or Quentin Tarantino has. I don't know. It's not a contest. It's just, he's seen a lot. And the notes here are, we talk about Ted Kosheff, Split Image, because he likes Ted Kosheff, the Canadian filmmakers. Here's some notes for Thomas More. So I have here Thomas More. And I have here beginnings. So this is the linear chronology. So I write down what I know about the person. Irish Catholic, dad was a plumber. It's the first thing I wrote about Thomas More. Not his soul books, not being on Oprah. I wrote that his dad was a plumber. I guess because it was important to me, maybe to him too, I don't know, that he has a plumber as a father. And that's going to create, I think it's kind of the blending of earth and sky or something, or material earthliness with spirit, which is very much his kind of, I think very much Thomas More would approve right of that. And I wrote in here, the quotidian, the humble, and the homely, and the deep were the words I wrote. Bodily integrity. And I wrote that the lab assistant, this is from one of his many books that he's written. He was doing a job as a lab assistant. His lab assistant says, "You will always do the work of a priest, Tom. Even if you don't go into the priesthood, even if you go into marine biologist, you will be something of a priest." You know, and James Hamilton. So these are kind of where I write names like I write to remind myself, like Ficino and Plotinus. Which brings up another matter. So I'm rather well educated in terms of shows. So I try to read all this stuff for a guest, but I also try to really be versed in some of what we call classics a little bit. So, you know, I've read Ficino and Plotinus, you know. So if somebody mentions them, I know how it relates, or Plato. And these things are regenerative because I come back to them. Right now I'm in the process of rereading Kierkegaard. Which is interesting, you know, but this is stuff I read for pleasure. So to me, Kierkegaard is light reading. It's beach reading, in a way. He's a major Christian philosopher, Kierkegaard. Soren, sickness unto death and fear and trembling. But I've read Kierkegaard before, but when I first read Kierkegaard, it was a very different time in my life. And so the other thing too about our show is that it happened when all this madness occurred. It happened during, I guess I mentioned this before, the COVID time, the pandemic, the plague, right? Just hit the world. And then political madness and insanity and destruction, which that continues. Actually, it gets worse. It's worse now than it was then, of course. And those are kind of circumstances that you can you might find yourself making a show under. And that's really challenging because, as I said, I wanted to make a show that was non-political. In some respects, apolitical. I never wanted to give advice. I don't want to be an influencer. You know, the most influence I would want to have is I play a piece of music and somebody might ask you, well, how did you do that scale? I might talk about that. That's the degree of influence and effect I want to have. Or maybe how to, so the ethics. So ethics isn't only knowing a guest's work. It's, if you are on that end, I'm looking at you, myself now. You were the other party, you're there and I'm here. And it could be audio, ear only, or it could be eyes. My responsibility is to you. So I'm going to sit here and my focus is going to be all on you as a person. I'm going to receive what you say at least for the very beginning of every episode. It includes Dr. Dodd, includes, I don't know, there's people coming up. Look, there's a woman who's a florist. I'm going to have a florist on my show. She's considerably younger than myself. I mean, she's probably 30 years younger. I don't know her age, but she's in Ingalls, and her life is plants and flowers. So I'm going to have the same attitude, approach to her as I would Ellen Burstyn or John Joss. Not that they're the same person, not that they're all equivalent. That's not what I mean. I mean the same level of respect. It's really, really important to me. The most important thing to me, if I have a guest, is I respect the guest. Because I had a sense, also another thing that I wanted to counteract when I did my show, is all the immense negativity that I saw. And, you know, don't get me wrong, there are other really, really good podcasts. There aren't many in my view, only a few, but there are good ones. But there's also a lot of just negativity that I hear and agendas. And kind of gotcha and kind of just all kinds of crap. And I felt so strongly about this, you know, that even if it was somebody said to me, well, you know, that sells if you attack a guest or if you create controversy, yeah, that gets clicks. But my feeling is, well, what does that do to a guest? I mean, I want my show to be a haven for an artist. I want an artist to feel like they can come on our show and, yeah, feel it's a safe space for them. That's actually the most important thing in my show. When it comes to guests, that's more important than even if I cover every aspect of the guest. That's it. So in those, I feel if the guest is respected, if I feel that I give them time and I shut up, like I'm talking now, but I shut up, listen to what they have to say, put the spotlight on them. I feel like I've done my job for a lot of it for that episode. That's my goal. And I had a sense, I can't prove it, I could be wrong, that artists are disrespected in our society, and it doesn't get discussed a lot. And they're also disrespected. Well, they're disrespected for many. It's not one kind of disrespect. It's a lot of front. So certainly they're not paid enough. So there's financial disrespect. People don't understand what they do. When their work is talked about, it's always talked about in only, as I've said before, ideological ways. Always, never aesthetic ways. And that's what we would call, it's moralistic. So it's always is one battle after the other, after another. It's always is that, I don't know. Well, I saw a headline is it a CIA op movie? So did the CIA make that film to give us bad politics? Is PTA in the pocket of big business? Just is the most absurd, you know, because it's a political movie, and is it on the right side, and does it treat African-American characters well? I mean, that's all anybody talks about. They don't talk about the actual movie, because when you're watching one battle after another, you're watching Sean Penn's outrageous, the way he uses his body, and he gets a hard on, and strange, you know, this revolutionary, this woman, he has this erotic dance with her, and they're wearing combat fatigues, and, you know, people have guns. So what I'm saying is that there's the feeling of the movie, and that's really what the movie's about. The movie is about this person talking to their dad. and they've had a hard time in their family, and it's a daughter and dad are having an argument at a ramshackle kitchen table. I think that happens in the movie. That's actually what the movie's about. It's about that. I mean, I'm not saying these other things aren't important in the movie, but they're less important. But people, this is the problem over and over again, that they want to make everything into a policy paper, a position paper. And that's profoundly anti-aesthetic. And I wanted my show to counter that. So, it's interesting. I'm trying to find so it's the feeling you get when you're watching a movie. It's the feeling, because the feelings is actually, it's actually what the thing is. What the thing is, because we feel things inside. Works of art make us feel things inside because we aren't machines. Actually, we're a different sort of entity and being than a machine or a computer. Now I found this. This is Melanie Mayron, and look at my notes from Mel. Look at that. Melanie Mayron. See the heart. First thing I mentioned is car wash. I don't know why. Michael Schultz, who died recently, the great African-American director. His style I mentioned here because he directed Car Wash. I mentioned the cast of Franklin Ajay, these great actors, Bill Duke, Yvonne Dixon, who also directed Rockford Files episodes and was a great actor. Antonio Fargas. These names, if you don't, another thing, this is what I mean by cultural literacy. If you don't know Franklin Ajay and Antonio Fargas and Bill Duke, check out what they did, their films, The Killing Floor, Nothing But a Man, Abby Lincoln acts in that. Michael Romer, who also just passed, great Jewish American filmmaker. Just all these names, it's great. It was exposed to these films. Anyhow, that's what comes up. Claudia Weil, of course I mentioned Eli Wallach, because she has all those scenes. Tell me about Eli Wallach. Vivica Lenfers, Christopher Guest. These are just little, I just write down sometimes little names, and the names I won't write whole. The names will spark something. I have here the sacred space of the actor. That sounds pretentious, but that's what I felt when I wrote it. The sacred space of the actor. And I mentioned Lily Sells Out, which is a reference to Lily Tomlin. Mazursky. See, I have Mazursky and Valerie Harper. It's my chicken scratch. And of course, she had just done a film called Snapshots with Brooke Adams and Piper Laurie, which I recommend. Watch Snapshots if you haven't. You can stream it. It's really good. She had done that year, and then she had just done that, I think, when we did our show. So that was all on my mind. Here's Jane LaCroix. Sometimes there's just 3 phrases, and I had here, number 1, rock and roll dad and cocaine written here. I don't know what that means, but pioneer of love. I mean, it's a reference to her family issues. I don't know. Rock and roll dad. I thought that was interesting. Free thinking mom. That's what I have on here for Jane LaCroix. So that's a peek into the very first season notebook. Very first season of our show. And when you're doing a show, the great thing about doing a show like Mel Mayron, I planned all that. I saw everything she'd done. Hustling with Lee Remick and Joseph Sargent. Joe Clayburgh, Lee Remick, and Mel. When you mention these things, these artists are hungry to talk about them. No one asks about these things. And they can really get into it. They'll think, I remember when this occurred. And they'll tell you a story. So many stories, There's a lot of stories there. Like the fact that Mel lived with the Mazurskis for a while when they were doing Harry and Tonto, which is interesting. You imagine a film director putting up an actor who needs a place to stay. He and his wife that's great, right? So January, what did I leave out? I'm sure I left out a lot. Time of grief, hard listening, I mentioned that. This was Laurie's idea to do this show, and actually now that I'm doing it now, I like it more and more, how a podcast is made. So there's cultural richness. I saw Cowboy Mouth, the 1970 Sam Shepard, Patti Smith version. I saw, Meryl Streep and John Cazale, her love of her life, Measure for Measure. And these are important productions, things I've experienced. The 1984 Hurly Burly, William Hurt, Harvey Keitel, Sigourney Weaver, Judith Ivey, Cynthia Nixon when she was 17, I think. Somewhere in there she was. Jerry Stiller, Ben's dad, Mike Nichols directing. Saw that. That same year, Sunday in the Park with George, Mandy Patinkin, and Bernadette Peters. Stephen Sondheim. So it does something to you when you experience shows like that. It really, really does. I mean, it does something to me. I'm not the same person. And you know, when I'm doing this podcast, I'm bringing that experience into the episode. It's not so much it's not only that there's a kind of prestigious, maybe famous things in the world that are created. It's also it's the cultural diversity aspect. You're actually experiencing the difference between one kind of thing and another. So if you see Cowboy Mouth and you go and see Jesus Christ Superstar in the same time frame, you are actually experiencing the breadth of the arts, because those couldn't be more different. They're both on a stage, but one's in a ramshackle church downtown and one's in a Broadway. They're just, there's a rock commonality, rock and roll commonality, but they just couldn't be more different. And you learn over time that art needs to be different from itself. It needs to come in different shapes and sizes. It needs to have different durations, short and long. It needs to be made by different kinds of people. And it's easy to forget that and to think it all has to be the same way. That every movie has to be the same way. And all music has to sound the same. It couldn't be less true than that. But when you experience it really close like that, that kind of, you could call it shock of the new. You get jolted. You're jolted you just learn that there's not one kind of play, obviously. If only because people making plays are just doing it so damn differently from each other. It is a profound philosophic question what the commonality is. There is commonality, but there's also, comedy and tragedy. It's like Billy Wilder talked about how Billy Wilder is on the record as saying he doesn't like to make dramas if he can help it. Anytime he has a project, he tries, if at all possible, to make sure it can be a comedy. He only does something else, melodrama, tragedy, as a last resort, only if he can't make it comic. And that was his rule. So Judgment at Nuremberg, which he did, couldn't be comedy, of course, but that's an outsized, in the Billy Wilder filmography, that's the exception. That's unusual. It's more like the Irma la Douce in The Apartment, and Some Like It Hot, right? It's more those type of pictures. But comedy itself has such a profoundly serious. All comedies, if they're good comedies, are so profoundly serious about ourselves, about life and death, about fate, about love, about conflicts between men and women, and men and men, and women, and as is Some Like It Hot, of course, and cross-dressing and gender. It's a movie from the 50s, but it's all there. Play that film today, Some Like It Hot, and it could not be more relevant in all of its time-bound datedness of 50s and Marilyn Monroe and Tony Curtis and Jack Lemmon. If I put on Some Like It Hot now, see them doing those songs running wild with ukulele and on the train. There's nothing more relevant, really, in a sense, than that. And that's another thing about art, is that it can be both very diverse and also speak across great distances, vistas of time. So 1957 could speak to me now. Right. So I discussed the ethics of the guest, and that was always important to me. I don't always feel like I do that the best that I could. I try. And, many circumstances, again, I can't be an expert on everything. I'm only one person. I don't think I'm a full polymath. I'm polymath adjacent. There's things I don't know, but I try my best, and I try to at least read one work by an author. And there's also the ritual of an episode. You got to get ready for it. I sit in my chair and I meditate and I pray, actually, for the best. So I ask for guidance that the guest feels good, and that they are satisfied and they're happy, and that I've actually honored the guest. Also honor what the guest is about, because it's not enough to just respect the guest. You also have to respect what the guest is about, which is a kind of an ineffable quality. A guest is about things. So what the guest grew up loving. Lynn Jebbins is a talent agent. She represents actors. That's that's something I know nothing about. I mean, even I did that show with her, and we talked at great length about it. But still, it's a mystery to me, because I don't do that. I don't hire people. I don't represent anybody, I don't think. But she talked about hiring, actors having to be put in shows. And in that show, I had to honor what Lynn Jebbins was about. So she's about a woman who was a roadie for a southern rock band in the South, moves to New York and wants to join theater and acting, and does it with gusto, and actually was involved in one of the great musicals of all time, Fats Waller's Ain't Misbehavin', the production I saw in 1978 with Nell Carter and Andre DeShields. What a cast. African American celebration of Fats Waller, and that's jazz related. I love jazz. She's about having played a role in casting that show. And, she's about talking about John Turturro, I think, who she likes a lot. Another actor. So that's what's important to her. So what a person's about could be what's important to them, what they love, not necessarily what I love or what's necessarily important to me, because it might be different. So I have to leave myself behind and meet the guest. So there's that. I've talked too long about that. I think that might be all for the moment, for part one of this is how I do a podcast, Other people will do it, of course, very differently, as they should, because they're not me, and also they're doing different kinds of shows, Again, my show is not a wellness show, and it's not an advice show, and I'm not uncovering secret conspiracies on my show, or hidden forces. That is not... I might uncover a hidden force in the production of a show or a TV show that maybe... So here's a hidden force. Dick Van Patten learned that his show was canceled in Variety magazine. No one told him he didn't have a gig and he wasn't returning to that production. He had to read that his own show was going to be canceled, and he was out of a gig in Variety. So that's a kind of very transparent behind-the-scenes story about one, in that instance, hapless poor actor who's encountering how things can be done kind of in a little bit shabby fashion. I don't know if that was I'm not a TV actor, I'm not in that world, but maybe that's a behind the scenes story. So please like and subscribe to our show, Journey of an Aesthete. And we will return for part 2 of this and future shows. And I hope I shed a little put a little spotlight on how I make shows, you know. So thank you, and have a great new year if that is possible for you.